Yep.
And great. So, as I mentioned, we're really excited this morning to talk about energy efficiency in housing. And again, I want to introduce Jesse Thompson from Kaplan Thompson Architects right here in Portland. And why don't you start off, Jesse, by just giving a little background about you and Kaplan Thompson?
Absolutely. Thanks, Troy. Uh, yeah, this is nice. Nice to have a conversation about these issues. So yeah, I'm Jesse Thompson, principal at Kaplan Thompson Architects. I think we're 18 people or so. We about 15 years ago, there were two of us, sort of a homegrown Portland business. And we are architects who work in single family and multifamily housing, a lot of affordable housing. We've also done some restaurants, but we're pretty much a New England architect. We don't work too much further than about 2 to 3 hours away from Portland. But we started out like a lot of small folks doing kitchen additions and small additions. And over the years, the projects have gotten bigger and more complex. But I think the exciting thing for us has been to really tackle the sustainability and housing issues at a larger scale. And I think it's sort of a testament to what Portland's doing as well, that we're back to building again. Portland was a pretty quiet city for a long time. I think, 1940 to 1995, not much happened in Portland. Not a lot of buildings got built. And I think that's not the case at the moment. There's changes in Portland. And so that's what we do as architects. And we've done some buildings around town. I've got a sort of a quick slideshow to ground it. But I think Troy, you're talking about energy efficiency and housing, and affordable housing was some of the topic. And I just think it's worth acknowledging that we're in just a ferocious housing crisis. That it feels like two things both at the same time. One is that a lot of people in our country don't make enough money to afford housing because they don't make enough money, that they aren't paid well enough. And that's a kind of massive issue. And then there's the issue of we haven't been building enough housing. And you get in these conversations, especially in Portland, where people talk about sort of an unprecedented construction boom and reshaping the city. And there's a lot of people really distressed about the changes to a very quiet, sleepy city. We have nowhere near enough buildings. And that's the strangest thing, is that, Munjo Hill, a 3-unit building on Munjo Hill in 1940 probably had 3 families of 5 people in it. It probably had 15 people in the building. It probably has 3 people in the building now. And so we don't have enough buildings just because of how we've changed how we live, let alone keeping up with the fact that we just didn't build very many buildings in Portland for a very long time. Like, I live in Deering Center, and my neighborhood basically looks exactly the same as it would have in 1970. There's just been a dormer or two, an addition. Like, we just didn't change very much. So that's, I think, this overlapping thing of an affordability crisis and a not enough buildings crisis is a sort of a things that come together into a really, really difficult situation. We work a lot with Avesta Housing, and they've got a waiting list of 2,000 families that they could house right now if they had buildings. And that's just a massive number. It's kind of a number that's hard, one of those things that's honestly a little hard to get your hand around. So then you have that, and then you have this climate thing whirring around us, which is the big macro issue. But the reason I think I started with the affordability question is, to me, you can't tackle a climate crisis if you don't have a roof over your head. If you're trying to figure out where you're sleeping that night, it doesn't really matter what's happening in 5 years, 10 years, or even next week. You need a house right then. And so we have to first, I think, really focus on getting people into enough homes, or else there is no focus on anything else. But at the same time, anyone who's in this room wants to focus on this other huge, scary issue. But I think we need to hold them both in our heads at the same time, figure out how we can work on the both. So that's what I think is the question. Now, I can show you a few things, what we've been doing. Let's see, Troy, did that work? Okay, so let's see. So this is us, a group of architects in the Old Port in Exchange Street. Yeah, it's fairly current. Let's see. So this is probably one of the first decent sized multifamily buildings we did in Portland. They're a set of townhouses down on York Street, and they were built in the mid 2000s, and they're kind of this nice little hidden building tucked back up. And Redfern, the housing built these, and we designed them. And this is one of our first interesting windows in this era of realizing that this is kind of this basic math, that when you have a house, and this is just energy physics, when you have a house, all the walls on the house touch the cold air. It's kind of simple. When you glue a bunch of houses together, not as many of the walls are touch the cold. Like, this is just kind of this sort of basic thing. And so when you build townhouses and you build them, you take the same energy efficiency strategies you do a net zero home, and you do a townhouse with them. They're incredible buildings because your neighbors share walls with you. And there's this essentially inherent efficiency. And it's sort of this sort of dumb lightning bolt moment when you're like, oh yeah, that's why we build cities. We build cities so that not everyone has to build their walls all on their own. That's really expensive and hard to do. And when you stick a bunch of walls together, things get easier technically, physically. And so this building is an incredibly energy efficient building. And it was our window into that that we had really great opportunities. This building, which is now, I mean, I don't know, 8, 9 years old now, down in Bayside, where the Bayside neighborhood organization asks for something really lively and fun. This is the first building that Portland Housing Authority had built in 30 years. You know, again, Portland Housing Authority wasn't allowed to build buildings either. They didn't have funding, they didn't have resources, and so they stopped construction in the city of Portland for 30 years. And this building is a passive house. So this is a extremely low energy building. And it was done because the client, Portland Housing Authority, what I find really, really interesting is some of the most energy efficient buildings we work on are for public housing agencies. And that's because they own buildings for a long time. And when you own a building for a long time, you really become very concerned with the bills. And it's very different than someone who builds a building to sell it. And so people with short-term gains just act very differently, you see, than folks who own things for a long time. So anyone who builds rental houses, and people like Avesta, people like Portland Housing, own their buildings. They're sitting there with buildings from the 40s, 50s, 20s, and they analyze their bills. And so they really, really get that building energy efficient buildings is good for their economics, because if they're affordable for a long time, then they have affordable housing. So here's just a quick little slide. I mean, this is the goal, right? We want buildings to have zero emissions. You know, here's a zero. That's what we all want our buildings to target. The average apartment building in the Northeast is a 69. And this is in thousands of BTUs per square foot. It's just a number, like, it doesn't really matter. It's energy use. And so this is where your average apartment building in the Northeast is. There's this thing called a passive house. This is a German energy standard, sort of obsessive German energy efficiency. And you can start to see is that if you build a passive house, this isn't about, this is just through conservation, through being really, really efficient with the resources you have, you can get it down to, you know, 14 or so. So here's the 69, you can get to a 14. Here is the Bayside Anchor building. It ended up, you know, around an 18, and it is a passive house. And that I think is interesting. There are solar panels on the roof. And so not only does it conserve energy, it also makes energy. And the making energy turns it into this very low energy building that back in 2013, the American Institute of Architects has this scale which says that we have targets. In 2015, let's try to build buildings that are 21s. In 2020, we'll do this. In 2030, we'll be zero energy. Well, in 2013, when we were working, okay, great. Well, now we're in 2022 and 2030 is 8 years away. What this pledge is that every building we do will be zero energy. It will make as much energy as it uses. Well, to do that, you better build a very efficient building. This is another building. This is called Paris Terraces, and this is a workforce housing cost building built down on Paris Street. This is part of the city of Portland redeveloped the public works lots, and a sort of a very interesting team put this together, and it has a few subsidized apartments, but mostly these were one-bedroom apartments that were sold for costs that a nurse or a firefighter could afford in the city of Portland. And here's an example. This is in South Portland across the river. So this is over in Red Bank, or called the West End of South Portland. And for Avesta Housing, we're building, here's 2 5-story buildings we're building that are all affordable housing. And this is a new downtown over, over near, I mean, it's kind of like, it's that funny part of South Portland, like behind Buffalo Wild Wings. But it's a really great residential neighborhood tucked in there by the airport. And these are all affordable housing built essentially to this energy standard, this passive house standard. But it brings us to, I think, one last piece which we want to put on the table, which is what we make our buildings out of has honestly become a really, really, really critical conversation. And so here we are in a climate crisis. We know we're burning too many fossil fuels. And Troy's cue was energy efficient buildings. So that is, after you're done making the building, you don't use very much energy. The sort of complicated thing about buildings is when you make them, you incur a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. So the thing you make your building out with, when you build the building, that all happens immediately. And that it either is a carbon dioxide emitter, or it could be a carbon dioxide sequesterer. It could tuck away and hide carbon dioxide. And so this is the funny thing about buildings. I mean, the car analogy is a good one. Like, you got to build a car. You 2,000 pounds of metal, 3,000 pounds of metal, and plastic and leather and foam and all this stuff. Then for 20 years, you drive that car and you burn, gasoline to go 12,000 miles. In a year, a car burns twice its weight in gasoline. This is why energy efficiency in cars is such a big deal. Like, literally twice as much weight every year you burn into the atmosphere in your car if you drive a gas car. Buildings are really different. Buildings are very big and heavy, and they actually don't use that much energy. They don't move around, right? They just, they keep themselves warm, they cool themselves. It doesn't take a ton of energy essentially as a building. So it turns out what we're kind of grappling with is what you make your building with is really, really critical. And if we are trying to solve our climate goal by 2030, 8 years away, there's a sense in which energy efficiency doesn't even start until you finish. And you better make your buildings out of things that don't emit carbon dioxide. And so what you're looking at here, this picture, is a really boring thing in the building. It's an elevator shaft. This is usually concrete block or concrete in an apartment building, because you have an elevator, it's got to not vibrate, it's got to not move around. Just in the last 2 years, we're suddenly able to build wooden elevator shafts. This is a solid wood elevator shaft, about 8 inches thick, and it replaces the concrete. And this is, these are trees. These are essentially a thing that pulled carbon dioxide from the air, and it is now hidden inside a building. This is, in a climate sense, this is pulling carbon dioxide and hiding it inside a building. And these wooden tall buildings is the huge new thing. And we really, really have to start moving away from steel and concrete buildings really quickly. We need to be building very tall wood buildings if we're going to build city buildings like the city of Portland should be building. And I think that's, that was the last little piece I wanted to show, was that there's what you do while the building's running, which is absolutely critical. And we in Portland are an old city, so we already built most of our buildings. This is where this huge effort in Portland needs to be to fix the buildings we've already got, because they already did their carbon emissions. They did their carbon emissions 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Now we need to stop them from burning oil, because that is already in the atmosphere, what we did to make Portland. But the new buildings, we have all the tools. As an architect, I think that's maybe the most exciting thing for us, is that the tools are all there. The technical problems are solved. We know how to do this. This isn't a question. You can Google energy efficient wall assemblies and all the technical things, like the technical puzzle is solved. Make buildings out of things that grow, not out of things that you mine, and make them insulated really well. And we can build incredibly safe, affordable buildings. All those buildings I showed were buildings that were built are occupied by people who are on the lowest end of the income spectrum, and they're some of the best buildings in our city. And I think that's this really interesting thing, that some of the best buildings in Portland are built by for the people with the least resources. I think we need to spread that to everyone. should be the goal. So that's just a little what we've been trying to work on and part of the puzzle. And it's something that lots of people are working on. And it's nice to be in a room like this with other people who are got these things in mind. So Troy, that was a little a good kickoff.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Jesse. I think you raised a lot of really compelling points that I'm sure a lot of people will have good questions about. Lots of prompts here to discuss. Just like kind of first thing comes to mind, like you showed the building with the wooden elevator shaft. Can you just sort of start, because that's something that Maine can produce that type of material. Can you, like, where is that technology? How far along is it? And is it,
Well,
something we can gonna see more of soon, or?
we're seeing a lot of it. Now, here's the depressing part. That came from Austria. That elevator shaft came from European forests, and it was milled on a CNC machine and came over on a boat. Now, luckily it came on a boat, and boats are incredibly, you give them a big push, they move across the ocean. They're like the most energy efficient transport you can do. This should be coming from Maine. We have the most forested state on the East Coast. We have an entire District 2 where the paper mills are closing, where people desperately need jobs, and we have a huge amount of timber. This should, like, the fact that this isn't coming from Maine just boggles my mind. We have the choice of Montana or Austria, or where we can get this from, or Northern Quebec. And Northern Quebec is so busy building buildings in Quebec that we can barely get them to ship to here. And there's been attempts to get that's called cross-laminated timber. And there's a plant that people are hoping was going to happen in Millinocket and Lincoln. It seems to not be happening. This is one of those things that we need somehow, I don't know how this works, investment to make this a CLT plant, because Maine could be having a ton of jobs. We could be feeding a huge amount of construction material in a climate positive way. The USM dormitory going up, SMRT is designing, has a lot of cross-laminated timber in it, and it's worth going to see it over in Bedford Street. And that's an example of, USM is seeing the same thing. Like, how do we make buildings with less steel in them? And those are passive house dormitory and cross-laminated timber dorm and commons. It's worth going over to see it, because the people are really doing this. All the materials being shipped in, not from Maine. I think one of the great stories in Maine right now is that some friends of ours, some actually architects, are starting an insulation factory in Madison, Maine. They took over the Madison paper mill, which closed. It was shut down by sort of a predatory venture capital firm. And they are reopening it to make insulation out of Maine wood fiber. And it's just incredible. There are 200 to 300 jobs in Madison, which has just been a town that's completely beat up by the paper mill leaving. And they are going to produce insulation products that we can all buy and put in our houses out of Maine wood fiber. And that's just, instead of fiberglass, instead of all the other materials that people use to insulate buildings. And that's hundreds of jobs coming. And I think that's really the linkage, which is Portland can supply the need for the jobs in Maine, in rural Maine. And that's the amazing possibility here, is that we use wood products from Maine and there are good jobs for everyone. That's the link that we need to close. But right now, Troy, yeah, those elevator shafts came from Austria. It's bizarre.
It is kind of crazy. So Ken had an interesting kind of technical question about like, how does the composite timber compare to, like, the CRT, cross-laminated timber, sorry, compared to other traditional composite lumbers in terms of?
Yeah, what it is it's called cross-laminated because they basically put down a web of 2x4s, then they rotate them 90 degrees, glue them together. It's just like the biggest chunk of plywood you've ever seen. And so you can just keep making them thicker. You could go 9 plies of 2x4, you could go 7, you can go 5, you can pick the thickness on what the strength you need is. There's an 18-story building in British Columbia built with cross-laminated timber. There are people pushing into the 20-story mark in timber high-rises in Europe and in the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, it is just sweeping through, like, your average office building is now timber instead of concrete and steel. It's coming really, really quickly. It has slightly different span capacities, but it's basically seen, it doesn't replace wood stud buildings. It's not for houses. It's not for 1 to 2 story houses. This is for big buildings. It's a concrete and steel replacement. But it's it's really fascinating because you can put together a building with 4 people with screw guns. So 4 construction workers working with timber lock screws and a crane are assembling 5-story buildings, where you used to, like in Maine, we have winter, and trying to pour concrete in the winter is just brutally hard.
Right.
You're tenting buildings. Like, the reason we use those elevator shafts in an affordable housing building was they were slightly more expensive than concrete block. But if you look around Portland, the way you do concrete block in Portland when you build in the winter is you build a giant plastic tent, and then you have to keep the mortar warm. So then you have kerosene heaters that burn night and day just to keep the mortar warm. And it's this crazy climate like explosion to try to keep concrete products warm building in a cold territory. And this elevator shaft came together, they screwed it together on a 20-degree day, and they were done in about 3 days, instead of 2 months of sitting there keeping a tent warm. So that's the kind of interesting thing. But in terms of strength, people are doing huge things with it. There's like basically just about any building Maine builds can be done in this manner.
So we can do 20 stories. You said that in BC there's a 20-story one, or?
Yeah, there are, and Norway, Finland, there's places, the wood countries are really pushing this along at scale, and it's lagging here. We're behind. There isn't, the Pacific Northwest really picked up on it because they just have a timber culture. Maine has sort of lost that. We're a concrete and steel culture for big buildings. We don't think of that in the same way as the Pacific Northwest does. So it's, the first time contractors do it, they're nervous. They haven't done it before. They're worried it's going to not work. But on this one, everyone is a little shocked, like, oh, that was way easier than we thought. So the culture will absolutely change. But the building codes, the key is that there's a group of people in Maine who worked very hard to change the building codes, because there was this old fire risk about these buildings. But what's, again, technically, they char, they don't burn. If you throw a tree in a fire, it doesn't actually just catch on fire. Newspaper catches on fire, but a tree doesn't really burn in a fire. It sits there smoldering. And these buildings also have fire protection, sprinklers, drywall on them, but they're like the old mill buildings. The mill buildings were all built with timber so that they didn't burn. And so this is a very time-tested, but it's taking people a little bit to get over the worries of big wood construction and fire risk. But Maine actually changed the rules very quickly. It's one nice thing in our state is you can get to people, and people will think smartly about things here.
So another sort of technical question in terms of with the passive house, rated type buildings, and they're really tight, what do you have to do to make sure the air quality is preserved inside the units?
Well, that is really critical. I mean, have the last 2 years taught us something about air quality? Like this pandemic, I mean, as an architect, to watch everyone walk away from all of our buildings, decide that our buildings were dangerous, and we left them. Our buildings sat empty because we were scared of our buildings. We knew the air quality inside was not safe. I think it's just a kind of mind-boggling thing that happened over the last 2 years. The passive house folks approached this from an air quality standpoint. And so what they did is they first started thinking, okay, we need fresh air for people. So we need a piece of machinery that moves fresh air in and out of the building. So we're going to have a ventilator. That ventilator is going to recover heat. So they made these sort of heat recovery cores that basically, when you're sucking in winter air on a day like today in Maine, it's very cold, and you don't want cold air blowing in your house. But if you take the air leaving the showers and you steal the heat from it, you can warm the air up coming in. So here's a thing called a heat recovery ventilator. The Germans said, well, that makes sense. We're going to put those in every building. We're not going to do a building that doesn't have a ventilation machine that brings fresh air to every bedroom and every living room in every building. And then we're going to take all the nasty air out of the showers and kitchens, and we're going to blow it out of the building. And we're going to do that on every building. And they basically said, well, once you have that, once you've put lungs in a building, then who cares if there's a hole in the skin of the building? Like, why do we want a hole in the wall of the building? How are we proving that we're getting fresh air out of a hole in the wall? Maybe it's in the attic, maybe it's in the basement. We don't know where those holes are. We didn't look. So being German, what they said is, let's put a fresh air machine in every building. And once we do that, then let's seal up all the accidental holes. Let's make holes that do something. And so that was sort of the idea, is that you give a building lungs, and then you will have a healthier building, but it won't waste energy because there's wind blowing through the building. And that was their approach. And so anything that is a passive house building absolutely has a really, really efficient fresh air machine in it. And like, we've got one in our office. We put them in all our houses. We put them in all the buildings. All these buildings we showed all have ventilation boxes. Most people in their houses have a bath fan. Their ventilation machine is a bath fan that blows out of the house, and you're hoping that fresh air comes in somewhere. And in most Maine houses, a lot of air does just kind of leak in the building. But the passive house folks said, let's make sure it comes in the right spot, and let's put a filter on it so it doesn't pull all the pollen into the house, and then we'll put it into bedrooms. And so that was the way that they solved the problem, was really thinking through ventilation and energy efficiency all at the same time.
We have as most people probably know, in Portland, we have adopted the stretch code, the IEC 2021, and South Portland is on the verge of it. They've passed it. It'll start on April 1st. And we have a question: how might that affect single family homes, and particularly around renovations?
Yeah, I think what codes are interesting, because codes are part of a consensus organization. There's a thing called the Code Council, and they debate these things on a national level. And they put builders in a room, they put architects, they put policymakers, people like Troy in the room, and they ask them, how do we get more energy efficient? And as always, there is a cost comparison. And so they're always staring at what is the cost you use to make the energy for your house versus what you save. And so one thing I think folks should know is that anything that was rolled into a national code was incredibly scrutinized, that if you implement these measures, they will save you money. And so the end effect is that renovations, there are legal triggers. Are you touching more than half the building or not? How deeply are you changing the building? So painting and patching walls and minor refits don't trigger big code changes, but an addition does. And so what the code is now asking, which is really important, is they say not only do you have to insulate a building, you have to make sure the insulation is continuous, so that, if anyone's framed a house, there's a lot of wood in walls, and sometimes you open up a wall and it's all wood, like there's like 10 studs next to each other. What the code now says is you have to have a continuous sort of down coat around your building. You can't just have little chunks of insulation in between the scraps of wood. And that's been the big change. And so you have to, in some way, do continuous insulation is the big change. And that means that walls are a little thicker than they used to be. Technically, some people do that by putting rigid foam on the outside. Some people there are some wood fiber insulations. Some people thicken their walls to the inside and add another layer of insulation. But it just says that you can't have a building where it's continuous, solid structural stuff inside to out. Is one of the biggest ways that the code has changed. The other way the code is trying to change is it is starting to test air tightness. It's saying, how leaky is your building? Like, we're not going to let it be an old Maine barn anymore. We're not at all even close to passive house, but it is saying you at least have to check, and you at least have to close up the holes that small animals can crawl through inside and out of your house. That's the level. Yeah, there's no big holes in houses anymore, is what the code is now saying to do, on a very simple way of a very technical issue. But yes, continuous insulation has been the big change, to not have interrupted insulation in buildings.
One of the things that I'm really fascinated by, Jesse, is that you pointed out that a lot of the best buildings being built in Portland are for Portland Housing Authority, Avesta Housing. What's the thinking in the commercial sector? How do we help the commercial sector catch up to think about doing more high performance buildings?
Well, I think that's a great policy question, isn't it, Troy? I think there are people who do the right thing because they are motivated and they want to. Some people do the right thing because of ethical concerns. Some people do it because of things like the people who own property. Portland Housing Authority is managing buildings that were built 100 years ago, like I said, and they are staring at their bills, and they really want their bills to be lower. And then there's other folks who need a little push. And that's what regulation is about. And that's what improved building codes is about. And that's why, and there's always a lot of noise around code changes. And I'm completely convinced that when the code said go from 2x4 walls to 2x6 walls, the builders industry of Maine came to the State House angry with pitchforks over moving from 2x4 to 2 to 6. And there was a lot of grumbly old guys saying this is going to ruin our businesses and this is absurd. And I'm pretty sure every single time we've changed the code, there's a lot of grumbly old people who really are upset about change and worry about the economics. I do think we have to have faith that these code organizations honestly are under huge pressure to not move too much economically. And that's why we've moved so slowly. That's why we have not changed quick enough. And that's why we have a climate crisis right now. So I think regulation is really the way we are going to change a lot of things, because if you are building a building to sell it, your incentives are not to do a good energy efficiency unless your customer asks for it. And it's really hard to be a customer of a building. What do you have to know to buy a house? It's a lot. You rely on other people to do that. You rely on building inspectors, you rely on cities to have good codes. And so I think that is where regulation is what will do that, quite honestly, on those levels. It's not much else. So people, and how do you change regulation?
Yeah.
Well, you get people like you in the room to show up at meetings to say to your city councilors, we like these rules. We want these rules to happen. We support these rules, because other people are showing up to say they don't like them. So this is the most critical thing, is people like us who care about these things have to show up to support policymakers when they say we're going to change things.
Well, and thank you, Jesse. I would like to just follow up on that, if I may, Troy.
Absolutely.
I think this whole dynamic is that people are looking at it as you can either have efficient, sustainable, forward-thinking buildings or affordable housing. And so I love all of your whole presentation was great. And I love that you guys are helping us lead the way to say, this is not an either or. In fact, it cannot be an either or, because it might change the capital costs and for building, or it may not in some of the cases that you were saying. But we can't. Some people are saying, well, maybe we should exempt affordable housing so we could have it. But cheap housing does not make affordable housing. Affordable housing is sustainably built. And I don't think we could go up to the legislature as, the generalist policymakers that we are, without solid examples of saying, this can be done. We just need to push people in this direction. So I really appreciate your presentation.
And that's Julie raises a good point. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, Julie, what I've seen is that the affordable housing folks have been building better than building code for the last 15 years because they've been really smart and careful. But we're now at a point where the code is caught up. And so that's no longer true. They aren't, with the buildings we doing aren't that different than building code, except in a few ways. There's few ways, like making sure there's ventilation in all the buildings is something that the code does not require. There are exemptions in the code that don't force people to do good fresh air in buildings. And that to me is just like, COVID should have taught us this. Like, we need good fresh air supply in every building, and that should be mandated, in my opinion. So that, I think, is one of the big loopholes that sort of hides inside the code, is you can now build a very energy efficient building, but you aren't forced to provide fresh air to people. So that's just a me thing. Yeah. And that is a cost increase. I have no way around that. Like, a machine that brings fresh air to every room in a building costs more than no machine, but it makes a much better building, and it makes much safer buildings for people.
We have Alan in the audience. Do you want to ask your question live, Alan? Why don't you unmute and ask?
Yes. My name is Alan Armstrong, and I'm thinking about retrofitting existing houses which typically have 2x4 walls and that discontinuous insulation and so forth. And I'm just wondering if there are generally applicable practical ways to retrofit the average Maine house to make it more energy efficient, things that make sense and you can really advocate to people.
Yeah, Alan, this is a great question, because we are an old state with a lot of buildings and we don't want to tear them down. Like, that's not good for much at all right there, to tear down our buildings, even if we replace them with great energy efficient buildings. Now that's sort of, I have done a lot of renovations, and I have taken buildings apart and stared at a 2x4 stud wall that was the only thing left and said, we could have actually framed that in about 3 days. And it took us 2 months to get down to this framing. And was that really the best practice? You know, so there is absolutely subtleties there. I don't think that every old building is worth saving by any means, but the old brick buildings, the old masonry buildings, especially. So in fixing old buildings, we've done a lot of renovation, and we've done, some of them were honestly experiments. Like I worked on my own house and it was a full-on science experiment, you know, experiment on yourself first. So there's 2 levels. There's a thing called weatherization. And weatherization is the technical name for fixing a house without doing deep surgery. So it is things like insulating your basement, insulating your attic, closing the gaps and cracks that the wind blows through, and making sure you've got good fresh air, you've got good ventilation. And that's the weatherization protocols. There's a weatherization program in Maine. And that's the kind of take it up to a level that isn't, I'm going to call major surgery. Then there's a level at which you bring it up to a modern standard, which is putting the down coat on the building. You're taking all the siding off and you are putting a layer of continuous insulation on the entire building. And you might be replacing every window in the building. That's a big thing to do to a building. And it's not something to do honestly, if the building is in okay shape. Like, to take all the siding off and throw it away on a building, you have to do that on old buildings. It's like siding only lasts, what, 50, 60, sometimes 100 years if you did it really, really well. So buildings get replaced all the time. So I think in our group, what we say is, if you aren't doing a major change, keep it to weatherization. Bring in someone. If you look up Maine weatherizing, there's a lot of people who are very skilled and a lot of companies who are good at it, who will come in, they'll test your building, they'll check for safety checks. Is your water heater safe? Is your furnace safe? Are you in trouble from carbon monoxide? They're going to check that. They are going to start with your basement and your attic, and they're going to make sure your basement and attic, your socks and your hat are really good. And they're going to do that, and you can absolutely drop your bills by a tremendous amount. So that's what we do. But if we're doing an addition on someone's house, or we are already replacing all the siding, well, then it's like, then you go big. Now the issue is this is renovation construction. We're talking about a building that's probably not very flat, that has been moving around, that humans have to go and cut and fit things on every spot of the house. It's slow, it's expensive. You know, there's no way that taking a building up and doing this sort of deep energy retrofit, these right now are, that's a $50,000 to $75,000 event to replace all the windows, add insulation on the outside of your house. This is a big thing to do to a building. And right now there isn't a kind of a very efficient process to do it. It's humans moving all over a building, cutting and fitting things to fit to an old building. There are some really fascinating efforts to try to improve this. Passive House Maine is working on an initiative. University of Pennsylvania, there's a whole lot of people working on how do we solve this on a big scale issue, which is how can you take a whole bunch of similar buildings and literally do things like laser scan them, factory produce a wall that comes out on a crane and bolts onto the old wall and is bolted onto the outside of the house. And you aren't going to do this to the beautiful old captain's houses and the Victorians. You're going to do it to the 1970s townhouses, the 1960s buildings, the easy buildings, the buildings that aren't sacred historic buildings is what you're going to tackle first. And so that's, I guess, Ellen, that's a complicated way, but it's either you go to a certain level of weatherization, or if you're doing a big change to a building and you're really changing the building, then you do it right and you add a lot of insulation to it. You're doing 3 to 4 inches of insulation on the outside walls of the house of that. And that's, I think, the way we're doing it when it's like, go big or stay home kind of thinking. But halfway is not great. Like adding a little bit of insulation on the outside, you can get into moisture problems. It's like, but a real addition or a real renovation is when because those happen pretty rarely. What, in Maine, every 50 years, 100 years, someone does something big to a house. Well, when you do that moment, do it right.
Thank you.
I just want to add on.
Go ahead, Julie. No, go ahead.
I just want to add on to that if you go to the Efficiency Maine website, you can look up Efficiency Maine. I don't know if the word is accredited or vetted, vendors, and you can search by what you're looking for: air source heat pump installers or weatherization folks. And so that will bring you a list of people who do weatherization.
And efficiency,
Julie, there's been a new batch of money for this as part of the Recovery Act that was missing, and there's finally money again to support low-income people for weatherization, because you can absolutely get subsidized help for if you meet income targets, and get a lot of assistance on fixing your building.
So yeah, and literally doubled, Efficiency Maine doubled their incentives and rebates for weatherization. So now they'll cover 50% up to $9,000 per home. So, which is pretty good. And they also have access to low cost financing programs. If people really want to go in and do a lot of work, there's definitely some support from Efficiency Maine to do that. So go ahead. Oh, so I was going to have a question, and kind of going back to what Julie was asking before in terms of like costs for high performing buildings, particularly in housing. How much of a premium, or is there a premium to do the initial investment in having a really high quality energy efficient building in the front end versus cutting corners?
That's what's been so fascinating, is that buildings are really expensive. Any building is expensive. Building a new house is a very expensive endeavor. Building buildings is a big deal. So we've seen the differences on apartment buildings to go from a building code level to passive house. The most efficient, energy efficient in the world is about 3 to 5% cost of construction. It's just 5% on the cost of a building is a tiny number. It's getting the money to build a building that's the hard part. But once you do that, the stretch really isn't a very big deal. And I'll say why that is that on larger scale buildings, let's say, a 5 or 10 apartment building, 20, 30 apartment building, it's really about construction culture change. So to air seal a building doesn't require different products. It requires people paying attention. And it requires someone to test them and hold their hand and say, like, okay, you hit the number or you didn't. And so testing the building, that's $1,500. So it's really, to get a well air sealed building that meets the German standard is about being a careful construction company and a little bit of extra tape and tape and sealing. And that's a real thing. You're spending thousands, but we're talking about buildings that cost millions. Then the insulation levels just aren't that much more on bigger buildings. Because that's not really where the heat loss is. Remember I said, like, when you stick a bunch of houses together, they don't have very many outside walls. You can picture your average apartment building in Maine has 2 outside walls. It doesn't have 6. It's got a couple of walls. You've got a neighbor above you, you've got a neighbor below you, you've got, your outside wall with your windows in it, but you aren't. And so your outside wall is the most expensive wall. And so it's easier to change. So it's on bigger buildings, it's much easier to be at this world-class energy efficiency level. And that's why, as a climate level, it just, this is the big thing. And the other piece that I think we've been talking about buildings, but we're all in the city of Portland. We are in, the biggest city in our state. Maine's biggest climate problem is cars. It's burning gasoline by far. So Maine's climate problem is really, really different than New York City's climate problem. In Maine, when you run the numbers, and it was the Climate Council of Maine ran the numbers, it's driving. That is where our climate damage is. And so how do we stop that climate problem? Well, that's by allowing people to live in our cities and to build buildings in our cities that we can fit more neighbors in and not drive cars, because then the whole equation changes, which is, if you're driving in from Buxton versus walking from downtown Portland, your climate load on the planet just plummets. And so where your buildings are placed is probably more important than anything else. And that's why I think the future is allowing people in our main cities to make room for more neighbors is a huge, huge thing. Because again, remember, there's a lot less people living in every house. So we need a whole bunch more houses. Like I said, Avesta has a waiting list of 2,000 people. That Bayside anchor building is a 40-unit apartment building. Right now, Avesta could build 50 of those buildings in Portland. And we don't have our heads around the idea of building 50 buildings right now. And that, to a lot of Mainers, feels like a character change in our whole we don't want our city to change that much, but it's changing whether we want to or not. And there's a lot of people sleeping on the streets because they used to have houses and they can't afford them anymore. So I really do think that we need to find ways to make a lot more room for folks in Westbrook, in Portland, in South Portland, in Cape Elizabeth, in Falmouth, in the town in Cumberland. These places need to allow people to build apartment buildings and people live close to where they work. That's a huge climate challenge. And efficient buildings are a technical problem and the code's going to fix that. The other one is a policy change and people have to fight for that.
So I think that's
the big climate one, in my opinion.
I think you're right on, Jesse. If you look at in One Climate Future, we did an analysis of like per capita, greenhouse emissions, and Portland and South Portland are much lower than a lot of the rest of the state because we are denser. So in our communities, we're different than the state as a whole. So buildings are our biggest emitter of carbon in Portland and South Portland, like about 60%. Transportation's 30%, which is kind of flipped upside down from the state as a whole. But kind of reinforces the notion that we need to bring more people to have lower carbon lifestyles.
It is, and when we come out of the pandemic, it's kind of funny. I never used to take the bus in Portland. I didn't like the bus. It was just like 10 years ago, you'd be standing on the side of the road, wondering where the bus is for 15 minutes. It's cold out. You don't know if it's coming. A few years ago, Portland did this brilliant thing where they gave every high school student a bus pass. And they shut down the high school buses. They say, hey, we've got a bus line. Let's give the kids a bus pass. Well, my high school kids taught me how to ride the bus. And Portland rolled out a GPS tracker. So you know where the bus is. And you walk out of your house when your phone says, leave the house now, the bus is coming. And I, endearing, my phone beeps and I walk down to Stevens Ave and I take the bus in the winter when it's really cold. And it's been so amazing. It's like there's Wi-Fi on the bus. I feel like an idiot. It's like, this is actually pretty nice. An endearing center, every year the pavement cracks and the trolley car rails pop out of the pavement. Like all of Deering Center was a trolley car neighborhood. It was built as a commuter neighborhood to get to downtown Portland on mass transit. And that's, our city was built around mass transit. And so we are ready. We are sitting there, and Portland Met, I'm amazed at how smart their leadership is and how much better public transportation's gotten in the last few years in Portland. It's way, way better. You pay on your phone, and so there's smart leadership working on transportation so that if you live close to downtown, it's pretty nice. And luckily my kids taught me how to do it and woke me up that it was actually much better than I remembered it was.
But, kind of on that topic, so Portland is currently undergoing what we're calling recode. It's the first time first time the land use code, the zoning ordinances have been opened up in over 50 years. And so the intent really is to encourage development of those walkable communities. How do we, add density off the peninsula in ways that preserve having, a good character neighborhood, a place where people are going to enjoy living, kind of what the planning department calls complete neighborhoods, where you can live in your neighborhood, you can go shopping, you can catch the bus and head downtown. So the whole idea is how do we, and we certainly could talk about that in One Climate Future as well, how do we encourage those types of development? So just a plug for our planning department's recode process. If we went to recodeportland.me, there's the code analysis has recently been published and accepting public comment. So it's a great opportunity for people to have some comment to our planning team and talk about what types of how do you think we should build the city in the future.
Sorry, that's a great one, because Portland is one of those funny cities where we built a city of small apartment buildings and houses 150 years ago, and then we made it illegal in the 1970s. Literally, like my first house I bought was a 2-unit in Deering Center. It was on a 5,000 square foot lot, and the minimum buildable lot in Deering Center was 6,000 square feet. And every one of my neighbors was 5,000 square foot lot. And the zoning said you needed 6,000 square feet of land to build a building. And I just have this theory is that Portland in the 1970s and 80s was really run down. And people looked at our city, and it's really hard with modern eyes to see it, and said, everything's a little too close together. It's kind of falling apart. We really should make it more like the nice, clean suburbs that you see out in Scarborough. And so they wrote this layer of rules, which basically sort of said our city should be a little further apart and a little more spacious and not so close together and so dirty. And those rules just stuck. And Portland was not a very economically thriving place in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. If you talk to anyone who was there, it was kind of a sad, rundown city. And so no one cared that the rules didn't allow construction because no one wanted to build anything. And so the rules didn't cause any friction. And what we've seen in the modern since 2000 era was people in the city of Portland said, hey, that doesn't make sense. Like, why on Munjo Hill does it say you need 4,000 square feet of land when all the lots are 3,000? Let's make them. And people started in downtown to align the rules with the way the old buildings looked. People started building buildings, and people who'd been in Portland for 30 years have been getting really, really upset. And really upset that there is so much construction because they grew up in a place that buildings didn't get built. And then we had an affordability crisis layer on top of that. And so people who owned homes, I think, have a very hard time understanding just how scary it is for everyone else. So if you happen to be here in this nice, quiet little city that nothing happened and you had a pretty good life, it was pretty nice. But it's not that anymore. A lot of people now want to be here, and we either make room for them or it goes into a crazy cycle of affordability. The thing that's strange as an architect is underlying everything is this hidden layer which makes things illegal. Anyone who's tried to put a deck or an addition onto a house off peninsula has run into these rules of like how it's really difficult to build things in the city of Portland on just a very basic level, because I think we wrote a bunch of rules that say we shouldn't build a lot of things. We should clean up the city in an old-fashioned kind of way. So changing those rules runs into some very complicated issues where there's a lot of people who like things exactly the way they look. And there's other folks who want it to be a thriving city full of young people, and that bartenders and cooks should have a place they can live, and people who work on construction should be able to afford the buildings they build. Those things require more buildings. And so that's where things get pretty contentious. But I think we are in a chance to smartly write the rules, at the very least, to allow what we did 150 years ago. Like, we should be able to build the 2 and 3 units in Deering Center that we built in Deering Center originally, like at the least, and maybe, small apartment buildings that take it a step up, because small apartments and buildings in Deering Center would be really, really nice.
So, Jesse, I think these are all like really fantastic points. And I wanted to put a plug in that South Portland is also going through an update of our comprehensive plan. And they're really, looking at taking the elements of One Climate Future and incorporating that into our future planning. And what I love about One Climate Future is that every single strategy in there is completely interconnected. And there's nothing that you can just head straight forward at in a vacuum, like, hey, we need more more houses, let's build more buildings. It's all a trade-off between, okay, well, people value their little pocket parks and their little open space, and how do we encourage infill development and not take down all the trees in our city? And so I think that people can use this to really be negative on projects, but I know that we can find a way forward and manage all of this, and manage to both create more density in South Portland, and do infill development and preserve trees. And that's what we're working on. We have a tree ordinance. We're trying to update zoning so that, we have maybe fewer entirely single family unit zones, and just figure out how to make what we've said about One Climate Future all along is that we're not trying to entirely change Portland and South Portland. We're trying to preserve what people love about these cities and grow from there. And so it's so fascinating how it's all sort of like interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, one thing I really would like people to take is that when you go to public meetings, and anyone here who attends public meetings, especially about buildings, the thing that people bring up is character. And I don't want the character of my city to change. And I really would like people to think that character are the people in the cities, not just the stage set. It's not just your scenery, it's who's there. And So we need to make a city, and maybe it changes visually, and maybe your scenery changes, but what's really important that is a diverse group of people of culture and what you make for a living, and that's important. We have to retain the character of the people, and that
It's
means
true,
making space
Jesse,
for
and
people
what,
to live.
yep,
It's not
and
just
what
a stage
people
set.
love
It's not
about
scenery.
neighborhoods is if you rank like why people move into neighborhoods, it's walkability, it's diversity, it's all of these things. So there's a bit of a little disconnect between us getting actual policies in place and what really makes neighborhoods desirable for people. Yeah.
And that's, to me, like, character is not just about what you see visually. Character is about what is going on around you. That's a big deal.
Totally. So yeah, I think that's an excellent. We're just about out of time, so I think that's a really important kind of point to end our conversation on. That you know, we're building our communities for people, or that's what we are really excited about. One Climate Future. It's not a plan of how do we put fancy insulation or heat pumps in people's homes. It's how do we make Portland and South Portland, help them be livable communities where people, are included and have a future, and have that also be present in 2050 when we are experiencing more impacts of climate change. So thanks so much. This was an excellent conversation, Jesse, and thanks for agreeing to sit down and talk with us. And thanks everyone for coming. Some great questions from the audience as well. And we will hopefully see you all again next month when we do the March edition of Coffee and Climate. So everyone have a great day.
Enjoy the weather. Thank you so much, Jesse. Every time I hear from you, I learn from you.
Yep. Great.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.